Hello everyone, this is Craig and welcome to a special episode, or should I say non-episode of Acid Horizon. Today we are sampling an exciting new project of mine, a debut recording for what I have called Left Hand. In the following monologue or lecture, if you will, we will explore Georges Bataille's profound essay, The Psychological Structure of Fascism, examining its deep psychological and philosophical insights. Left Hand aims to create a blend of philosophy, politics, and psychology, a lot of the things that you would see on Acid Horizon anyway, but offering a unique perspective on these interconnected research areas. This is just a taste of a kind of long-form content you can expect from Left Hand. Now, just to be clear, I did not decide to go solo. In fact, what we wanted to do at Acid Horizon was to start providing courses to our listeners and viewers. But in the interest of keeping things inexpensive and keeping things accessible, I didn't want to charge $175 or $225 a pop just for a course. Rather, I wanted to create a separate Patreon account, YouTube channel, and podcast feed for these offerings. We live in a world where the university and the humanities are in crisis. And truthfully, there's no reason that these conversations, that these discussions need to be sequestered inside the walls of academia. With that said, you can join Left Hand for as low as $5 a month. You don't even have to join as a paid subscriber, but if you do, one of the first benefits that I will offer is early access to monologues, interviews, and short videos. Now, as I said, this channel is dedicated to hosting my personal research interests. However, sometime in the near future, the others on Acid Horizon may also be launching their own course content as well. If you want to stay updated, visit our webpage at acidhorizonpodcast.com and stay updated. But for the time being, if you want more in-depth discussions and more exclusive content, be sure to check out the Patreon page for Left Hand. It's in the show notes below. And with all of that out of the way, please enjoy the first part of The Psychological Structure of Fascism by Georges Bataille, as presented by yours truly, Craig, or the moniker that I use on Left Hand, Surrepti. This is Left Hand. Greetings, one and all. My name is Surrepti. I am the host of Left Hand, and many of you may already know me as the host of the Acid Horizon Theory Podcast. Well, I am still the host, but I created Left Hand for a very specific purpose. Some of the things that you can expect when listening to Left Hand are more of Deleuze and Guattari, more of Bataille's work, more of the post-structuralists, but also some other things that I'm interested in: psychoanalysis, the work of James Hillman, mythology, mysticism. And this is also a channel where I will probably review some recent books that I've read, particularly newer books on politics and culture with a left-wing bent. And so, if you haven't figured it out already, Left Hand refers to two things. Of course, it refers to the political side of the podcast, but also it is an inversion of a particular image of a right hand in the alchemical tradition, which also inverts many of its associations. Left Hand is not only the left-handed path of alchemy, but the symbolic left-handedness of the profane, of base materialism, and a destituent politics. But also, I thought it was a fun image and a fun play on words and meanings, and simply an excuse to bring to listeners not only of Acid Horizon, but who are also familiar with my other work, focused discussions on texts and themes that I like, but also to keep it buoyant and to keep it relevant. And for the first topic, I thought I would pick someone who I think would be a strong avatar of this channel, but not only the person, the essay itself, which is The Psychological Structure of Fascism by Georges Bataille from 1933. And if this is your first encounter with Bataille's work, I'll just give a brief introduction. Georges Bataille was a French intellectual known for his contributions to philosophy, sociology, and literature. His work often explores the limits of human experience, the nature of transgression, and the dynamics of power in society. And that's what we'll discuss today in the Psychological Structure of Fascism. Bataille examines an intricate and often unsettling relationship between economic structures, social dynamics, and authoritarian regimes. And I think especially in 2024, it's an election year here in the United States, and we all know what's happening in our current political milieu. I think a return to Bataille's analysis of fascism is an apt move to make at the moment. And one of the things that I attempt to do in the next 50 minutes or so is to talk about how Bataille's work is still relevant today and gives us a clear picture, for example, of how it is the case that people fall victim to the allure of fascist desire when it is also the case when the very same forces that instigate a turn towards fascism that we also brush up against a revolutionary desire. And Bataille, I think, is somewhat successful in helping us to see how the structural exploitation of the proletarian worker can also invoke a possession by fascistic forces. So with that said, we can turn to the material. But before we do that, I want to let listeners know, listeners of Acid Horizon, that Left Hand has a separate support mechanism, which is the Left Hand Patreon page. And for the time being, there are going to be 3 tiers. Please subscribe at a level that's comfortable for you. By becoming a supporter of Left Hand, what you are saying is that for the time being, Craig, bi-weekly, I would like you to produce 2 bi-weekly monologues or lectures, and maybe more in the future if we get some more supporters. So maybe to start out, let's try to get 20 supporters at the $5, $10, or the $25 level. As interest in this particular podcast begins to snowball, as it will, I will do what I can to offer more to listeners and viewers. And perhaps many of you already know, I have a merch store that's associated with the Acid Horizon podcast. Of course, that's another way that you can support me. I will put the link to that merch store in the show notes. And go ahead and grab yourself a philosophy t-shirt or a mug or some stickers or something. I have a lot of stuff in there, and it's because of my design shop that I can continue to bring you episodes like this today. And with that said, let's take a look at Georges Bataille's The Psychological Structure of Fascism. So the entry point into Bataille's essay, The Psychological Structure of Fascism, is actually a Marxist entry point. And in order to understand what Bataille is trying to do, we need to understand a little bit about his relationship to Marxism and the politics of his time. Bataille has a very nuanced perspective on Marxism, and one of the things that he is attempting to do is to avoid some of the familiar economic reductionism that's ordinarily associated with a Marxist viewpoint. But I think that it's important to note that Bataille actually starts from Marxist predicates and uses basically a partly Marxist methodology to get us going at the beginning of this essay. And one of the ways that he does that is by highlighting the distinction between base and superstructure. Now, I am not going to assume that everybody is coming to this particular essay with a strong understanding of Marx or even a meager understanding of Marx. So simply put, the concepts of base and superstructure are used by Marx and Engels to explain the relationship between the economic foundation of a society and then its cultural and political and ideological institutions. So the base refers to what we ordinarily understand as the economic structure, which ultimately comes down to the question of who is it who actually owns the means of production. So, for example, in the capitalist society, it's the capitalists who own the means of production. In a feudal society, it would be the feudal sovereign or the monarch. And then let's say you live either in a band or a tribe in a pre-modern society. It's most likely the case that your social relations have a more egalitarian character. Now, for Marx and Engels, that constitutes the base. It's the social relations that come out of the class distinctions based upon the means of production. Now, what Marx and Engels call the superstructure encompasses the totality of cultural, legal, religious, artistic, and psychological ideas and beliefs that predominate within a particular society. And they believe that these things emerge from the economic base. And for them, there's a way in which contestations at the level of superstructure will fall back upon the base and create a kind of reaction that might influence the base, but ultimately, in the last instance, they tend towards the belief that it's the economic base that informs the nature of social relations. Now, according to Bataille, Marx and Engels did not specify in their analysis how specific modes of religious or political expression arise from economic conditions. So what Bataille is attempting to do in this essay is to create a general theory of the psychology of fascism using these Marxist predicates, but with an emphasis on the distinction between the production of a social totality and how and why certain members of the social body are either included or excluded accordingly. And so the psychological structure of fascism it's incomplete and does not include detailed explanations of its research methods or arguments for why its approach is new or different from previous works. And despite these omissions, Bataille's main goal here is to explain the organization and nature of fascism, and it begins by describing the overall social structure in which fascism arises. Now, Bataille's study of fascism attaches to a larger question in the history of 20th century thought, which is, how can we overcome this rift between psychological analysis, for example, Freudian psychoanalysis, and Marx's insights about the historical development of capitalism, for example? And why is this essay named as such? Well, before we get into that, we might want to say that there are others in the sphere of early 20th century continental philosophy, for example, and psychoanalysis, who tried to mend the split between Marxism and some of the dominant psychological ideas of the time. And the question of why fascism, why is it that people turn towards fascism? Why do people opt for a kind of servitude rather than seek their salvation? Why does that emerge as a dominant question? Well, given the fact that if, for example, you are of a Marxist persuasion, and you see the heightening of the contradictions of capitalism. One, for example, being that Bataille talks about very early in the essay, which is over time, the capitalist class gains more and more power by virtue of its exploitation of the proletariat, its ability to appropriate the surplus generated by industrial production, for example, and the workers making very low wages, no health care, poor factory floor conditions, and so forth. Why isn't it the case that they ultimately revolted in the industrial core of the world? Marx and Engels inaccurately predicted that revolutions would break out in places in Europe like Britain and France, but in fact, they happened in places where capitalism had not developed. In fact, Russia and China, where essentially at the beginning of the 20th century, these countries were still living within a feudalistic context and lived under a feudal mode of sovereignty. And this remains a curious fact for Bataille throughout his research, especially in Volume 2 of The Accursed Share, and then the corpus of notes that comprise Volume 3 of what is called The Accursed Share, Volume 3. And so the question remains, why is it that in the imperial core, where these contradictions of capitalism were escalating over time, if we are to take the Marxist viewpoint about things, and why is it that the masses opted for fascism? And so this brings in the question of the adequacy and the soundness of Marxist theory in its theorization of base and superstructure. And this is why Bataille turns to a sociological and an anthropological analysis of social forces on the basis of a distinction between two things, two important terms that we're going to keep mentioning here today. One is the homogeneous realm of the social body or society, if we want to call it, and what he calls the heterogeneous realm. And for Bataille, it's what happens both within and between the thresholds of the homogeneous realm and the heterogeneous realm that's going to help us explain why, in the last instance, we need to have a psychological analysis of fascism. One of the core claims he makes by the end of the essay is, it thus appears that the unity of fascism, meaning How is it that all of these disparate elements within the social field come together to form a fascist assemblage? How is it that it is located in its actual psychological structure and not the economic conditions that serve as its base? So here we see a fundamental departure from Marxism, and what I believe marks one of the incipient moments in a larger shift towards rethinking the politics of the desire after the formation of the Soviet Union and on the cusp of the founding of fascist movements in places like Mussolini's Italy and, of course, Nazi Germany. However, we cannot leave aside the importance of Marx and Engels' work, especially in Bataille's pointing out of a fundamental dynamic in the way in which certain classes get excluded from what is called the homogeneous realm of society. And it's quite interesting to see right at the top of this essay that Bataille points to the concept of money, the flow of money, who gets the profit, as being an important precursor to the establishment of what might be the base conditions that ultimately allow fascism to come into being. So, in a certain sense, in a certain proper sense, what we understand as fascism in the 20th century requires capitalism. It requires the collision of abstract value, of capital, with wage labor, which is essentially the fundamental condition for capital. But for Bataille, there is a kind of social homogeneity that's familiar to both capitalism and the real existing communism of the time that attends to a kind of productivism or utilitarianism inherent to both economic logics. And later on, Bataille will go on to say that it's actually communism, which is the utter realization of the productivist logic and actually outstrips capital in some sense. But in the capitalist mode of production, a unique type of social exclusion occurs. So, with the creation of the capitalist edifice and the productive edifice of capitalism itself, you have the circulation of capital, the creation of commodities, their sale on the market, their consumption, and so forth, and the metastable conditions that allow that particular configuration to keep on running. And the example that Bataille draws upon at the very beginning here is quite apt because I think it pertains to the political reality of our time as well, which is an admixture of the middle class and the petty bourgeoisie in buttressing this notion of social homogeneity. One thing that we might say is typical of the petty bourgeoisie and the middle class working in concert together, that's perhaps distinct from capitalists at the scale of industrial capitalism and financial capitalism, if you want to call it that, is that they are close to the proletariat in that they probably share many of their values. But like the artisan class under feudalism, they are the avatars of social homogeneity insofar as they have relative ownership of the means of production. I mean, there's a variety of small business types or small business owners that we might think of who pride themselves on the fact that they used their capital that they saved as workers to build up enough of a fund to build their business, or build their side hustle or what have you. And they are living proof of the fact that somebody can use the means of the capitalist system to strive to a level where they can get things that they want and enjoy the objects of consumption that not everybody can enjoy. And so we might say it's the optimism and the enthusiasm of the middle class that then lends to this belief that we do not need to escape capitalism, that there are opportunities within the system to grow one's personal wealth and enjoy the kinds of things that everybody wants to enjoy. But all of this occludes the fact that the proletarian is structurally excluded insofar as they do not reap the profit of the homogeneous productive mechanism, that they don't have a say and where those surpluses go, whether it goes into their pocket or into some larger social fund. So we might say that there's a question presented to the proletarian worker who is perhaps on the cusp of becoming a member of the middle class as to whether or not one should increase their bid to become a member of the middle class. And there are a lot of questions involved here that might be lurking beneath the surface. And to vindicate Bataille's view, there's a psychological dimension here. And that has to do with things like values, tastes, whether or not one is willing or able to navigate the complexities of the cultural signifiers and ideas of the middle class, for example. It could also be a question of whether or not one is either willing or able to overcome some of the habits they developed as a low wage worker in terms of the way that they use their money. And so, just to shore up an argument with regard to Bataille's approach, there's a level at which desire and political desire has a psychological dimension and involves an element of psychological decision. And it's here that we should begin to talk about what Bataille means by homogeneity or social homogeneity. And in this essay, it refers to those parts of society that are uniform, that are orderly, that are governed by fixed rules, standards, mores, normative practices, and so on and so forth, that lend to the reproduction of that system in a consistent and reliable way. And so, what I would like to do for the rest of this presentation are two things fundamentally. First is to highlight the distinction between what Bataille calls homogeneity and heterogeneity, and then elaborate some of the basic functionings of those categories. And so, we'll begin with homogeneity. What constitutes homogeneous functioning in a society? What constitutes a social order? Well, a few different things. The first thing is commensurability and order. So things within a homogeneous society, the elements of a homogeneous society are comparable. They're measurable. Social relations are things that can be sustained by a common understanding and an adherence to these rules and standards that lead to a kind of predictability and stability. And we can venture a few general examples. For example, the rules of fair play. If, for example, you are a student in high school, that your essay on Shakespeare's Hamlet will be evaluated in a way that's equitable with respect to other students in the class. Of course, there's special needs students, for example, and maybe there's accommodations or modifications that we need to make. But even when a dispensation is made for particular kinds of rules, there's a general understanding or a sense of understanding as to why that is sometimes the case. Now, another facet of homogeneity are certain regularities surrounding economic production. A homogeneous society is concerned with productive activities, activities that are useful, they're measurable, and often they are measured in terms of money. So, economic transactions and social value are based upon calculation, forms of equivalence. And when it comes to the basic economy, that equivalence extends to different types of work and products. So, an example here is that your average consumer, when they head down to Target or Walmart or wherever they go, they know that an 8-pack of paper towels is not going to cost $79. And so, we might say that our collective sense of homogeneity is challenged when, for example, prices skyrocket or inflation cannot be reined in. For example, here in the United States in 2024, I saw something online recently where a shopper who had been shopping online via Walmart, I think it was, had made an online order 2 years prior and made the same order this year. And it was something on the order of like 3 times higher than normal. And so, to get a stronger sense of what Bataille means by homogeneity, we can connect these instances in which regularities or expectations regarding prices, for example, or aspects of the economy seem so completely out of order that it seems like the system is going to completely crash out. And so when it comes to people making bids or investments into their existing political system, we have to think about the ways in which regularities surrounding economic production and consumption are maintained. Another important aspect of homogeneity is how a society handles what it believes to be useless or unproductive elements. This is something that I will discuss in more detail as we progress deeper into this discussion. But for the time being, it's important to note that Bataille has a very sophisticated theory of what he calls non-productive expenditure and its role in the larger economy. But in general, when it comes to being an ordinary subject in society, the expectation is that, of course, you become a productive member. And if you're unproductive in certain ways, we look for ways for that to be remediated. But of course, there's going to be a lower limit. There's going to be things in the restricted economy that are going to be seen as absolutely unproductive. And there's going to be a special handling on a case-by-case basis for those things. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Another aspect to homogeneity and homogeneous society is one's reduction to function, that individuals in a homogeneous society are valued based on their utility and productivity. And they're often seen not as unique individuals, but as interchangeable parts of a larger productive system. And this is something that Bataille rails against quite a bit, especially in his critique of Stalinist communism. Now, of course, the one thing that both real existing capitalism and real existing socialism of the time did share in common was the purported modularity of the worker, that workers could do different kinds of jobs and get trained for different kinds of things. When Bataille analyzed work programs that were implemented by Stalin, one of the things that he noticed is that it tried to take this modularity of the worker to its highest logical limit, to the exclusion of leisure time. And one of the things in Bataille's mind that communism was meant to promise was not only a freedom from capitalism itself, but a freedom from certain expectations, social expectations around work. And the last thing that we will talk about with respect to homogeneity and the production of a social whole takes us right back to the beginning of this discussion, which is in a society with class distinctions such as capitalism, it is those distinctions which are responsible for reproducing the character of the social whole. In this case, we're talking about the middle classes versus the proletariat. While the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class is seen as the foundation of the homogeneity, the proletariat is only partially integrated into it. So, for example, when a worker goes to work, they are recognized on the basis of their ability to be a producer. They are recognized on the basis of specific functions they have as a worker. And once they clock out for the day, their relationship with their boss and perhaps even their manager is terminated in many cases. And often it's discouraged for them to maintain any kind of relationship outside of work, depending on the specific nature of the culture within which you live. And it's specifically at this point where Bataille attempts to overcome a certain vulgar Marxism, or maybe some people would say an orthodox Marxism, that is bent on reducing everything to an economic relation. Because for Bataille, it's not simply that the proletarian worker has been deprived of their ability to control the surpluses that they have created through their labor, but outside this form of brute economic exclusion, those who only have their labor to sell develop collective identities. They develop cultural tastes, their own cultural signifiers. And these things, of course, are a reaction to that exclusion. However, the analysis cannot stop here because even the manifestation of the proletarian identity then commingles with various aspects of the bourgeois and middle class identities. And this, in many ways, compounds the challenges to the kind of analysis that Bataille is seeking to undertake here. So with that said, that takes us to our next big concept, which is heterogeneity, or the heterogeneous realm, as Bataille says. And so the basic character of what he calls heterogeneous is that heterogeneous elements are those that cannot be easily integrated into the orderly, the productive, and the measurable framework of homogeneous society. And this includes anything that doesn't conform to the fixed rules and standards of social economic life. This also includes those elements of society which see themselves as being more elevated or more noble than the values attributed to the social whole, but it also involves those things which are too repulsive, too disgusting, or too irredeemable to be considered part of the social whole as well. And this is where things actually get very complicated. But one of the places that we can start here, in terms of noble values, for example, we could think of somebody like Nietzsche, whose whole life project is essentially a valorization of the transvaluation of values, taking the values of one's age, the current table of values, breaking those values, and finding new values. That action, that project is something that stems from a kind of heterogeneous mindset, something that exists outside of the known social whole. And we should note that this, of course, can have both a positive and a negative value, or a positive or negative connotation, depending on what your values actually are. If you wanted to establish a world in which the workers own the means of production, this would mean instituting a new value that is not extant in the table of values under capitalist society. If, on the other hand, you believed in some sort of neo-cameralism or the rise of some sort of new aristocracy that would eliminate all the problems of modernity. Both of these particular political ideations and others of its kind, like fascism as well, can also be considered as heterogeneous to the homogeneous social whole. Another way that Bataille is going to have us think about heterogeneity is through the concepts of the sacred and the profane. And we might say that even though it's the case that these are brutally theological concepts, that there are secular variants of this. The notion of the sacred, of course, is linked to things like religious or mystical experiences, but the notion of the sacred also accounts for why some leaders or shamans within a society or a king might have special powers or that their body is imbued with a kind of mana. Whereas on the other side of this continuum, we have the profane and the objects or practices that are deemed to be taboo, such as incest, or in some cases, as Bataille notes, having sexual contact with women who are currently in their menstrual cycle. These kinds of taboos or prohibitions, which seem on their face to be irrational, have very specific social functions to ensure social cohesion. So once again, on the one side, you have the sacred, which is sometimes associated with a concept like mana that we get from Polynesian cultures, surrounds or is imbued within certain figures, people, objects in a society that give them a kind of political legitimacy. On the other side, we have taboo as the uncrossable threshold between the homogeneous and heterogeneous realms. And as Bataille notes at about the midpoint in this essay, we can look at a fascist leader or a fascist figurehead as engendering or embodying this kind of transcendent power that's akin to mana. And in psychological or libidinal terms, this is important in constructing the circuit of desire that creates the fascist assemblage. Now, as we mentioned earlier, unproductive or non-productive expenditure is another important aspect of the heterogeneous realm. Heterogeneous elements include things or those aspects of society that are considered wasteful or excessive. And this encompasses a breadth of things that are rejected by homogeneous societies, such as bodily waste, taboo subjects, erotic elements, dreams, neuroses, and also various forms of life that defy assimilation, like mobs, aristocrats, rebels, squatters, anarchists, and so forth. Anything that could enjoy or potentially exploit the productive surpluses of the homogeneous social whole without contributing to them is something that vies for a sovereignty which opposes the order of things as we understand it from the perspective of homogeneity. And unproductive expenditure also brings into focus things like violence and disorder, of which there are several kinds. This, of course, can include fascist gang violence that we saw in the lead up to the rise of Adolf Hitler around the time of the Beer Hall Putsch. It can involve gang violence that we see today in the United States and elsewhere in the world. It can involve anarchist riots, uprisings against racial violence and climate change and so forth, all factor into what can be seen as either a kind of general chaos or an incipient transformation of society in some way, and all of this is considered to be heterogeneous. And given that we have these disparate and often very contradictory elements within the heterogeneous realm, it's important to note that heterogeneity for Bataille is marked by a duality and opposition. And he emphasizes this dual nature, and it often involves making a distinction between what is both pure and impure. And this sort of attends to the distinction between sacred and profane yet again. But it is precisely that distinction between sacred and profane, pure and impure, that leads to one of the most, what Bataille believes is one of the most important aspects of the heterogeneous realm, which is the psychological force of attraction and repulsion produced by those elements. So in the case of an emergent fascist leader, there's going to be a kind of psychological attraction. That individual is going to rarefy themselves, elevate themselves to a kind of transcendent figure, whereby they are going to accrete a collective desire around them. One of the ways then that fascism generates or continues to generate its power is in opposition to what it sees as impure elements in society. So, of course, in the case of Nazi Germany, Hitler and his coterie were able to tap into an existing anti Semitism in German society and amplify it in such a way as to gain a kind of strength in reaction against what they framed as a repulsive element in society. And of course, in current fascist and proto fascist movements within our society, anti Semitism continues today. But also, of course, there are new scapegoats. In the Anglophone world, particularly here in the United States, we see reactionary groups disparaging this concept of wokeness, which is often a code for a kind of anti-Blackness, anti-queer, anti-transgender sentiment, which also finds its variants on the left, who often co-opt the rhetoric of the right, not only to put forward a class-first politics, but often they engage in some of the polemics that attributes a kind of degeneracy to those elements of society. One of the tactics that we sometimes see from these groups is an attempt to amplify a sense of repulsion towards what they try to frame as unsavory segments of society. For example, if you've been marked as one of their enemies, they will try to put out the most unflattering picture of you possible. And many of us have probably seen those videos online where people go to the open air drug markets in places like Skid Row or parts of San Francisco or Philadelphia, and they will drive by and take a video on their phone, put it online, and inevitably these videos will end up being used by far-right groups to push a narrative that has an either subtle or very overt anti-Black narrative attached to it. And perhaps there's one more thing that we should say about the heterogeneous realm, which is heterogeneity is also related to the concept of sovereignty. This is another complex topic which Bataille articulates somewhat through this essay. But it's important to note that the notion of sovereignty and imperative authority, which Bataille discusses, is something that finds its provenance within the heterogeneous realm. But remember, there's also that dual nature of the heterogeneous realm. On the other side of the sovereign continuum is the absolute destitution of sovereignty and the normativity of the homogeneous social whole. And although Bataille doesn't use this essay as a way to establish the foundation of an anti-fascism, through his concept of homogeneity and heterogeneity, we can intimate the nature of the rivals of the fascist and what is the nature of the power that then would either subvert or contravene the sovereign authority propounded by the fascist leader. Okay, so now that we have the concepts of homogeneity and heterogeneity in mind, we can move forward with Bataille's analysis of the psychological structure of fascism. And one of the first places he goes to is the state and the role of the state. And one of the primary functions of the state is to protect and insulate the homogeneous realm. One of the roles of the state is to stave off those unruly elements that stand to undermine the social whole or social homogeneity. And the protection of the homogeneity ultimately lies in what Bataille calls imperative elements, which is to say those authoritative forces, unambiguous laws, or those mandates which command order. Now, the interesting thing that Bataille says here is that the state is not itself an imperative element. It is an intermediary formation which stands between the various elements of the broader totality. And what he means is this. So, for example, things like kings, armies, nations, heads of states, dominant institutions, all of those things might have a distinct or particular character to them, but on their own manifest a kind of sovereign agency or sovereign power. For Bataille, the state is an entity which is formed through an interplay of these institutions and their practices. And one of the key ways, for example, that liberal democracies attempt to mitigate the interplay of these forces is through something like parliamentary power and the other deliberative and juridical processes that we typically understand to be familiar to a liberal democracy. But he also observes that there's all kinds of states out there. There's a continuum of sorts. You know, on one end, we have what we might call a democratic state. And then at the other end, there's what we would call a despotic state. And the character that states take on depends upon many things. But there's two fundamental dispositions that the state can take. One is one of adaptation or authority. So states have different functions depending on whether an isolated individual considers themselves an end of the state or something which holds up the nation and its character. So if, for example, you live in a state like the United States, for example, is characteristically more libertarian than, let's say, a place like England. And because of that, we never developed anything like the National Health Service. And despite the ways in which the NHS is being undermined in the UK today, the institution itself is nonetheless an object of political discourse around which certain laws are passed and a certain political ideology continues to be buttressed in lieu of the fact that maybe things are going south for socialized healthcare in the UK. But of course, these generalities and cliches about the United States or the UK probably don't work in our world the same way that they used to, especially as everything is moving further and further to the right. In places like Texas, Oklahoma, and Florida, for example, we are seeing more and more draconian laws as we shift to a more despotic state model, especially as local governments attempt to eliminate funding for things like sex education and take a stand in the broader culture war that's unfolding in the US. In any case, for Bataille, ultimately the purpose of the state is to maintain the sense of social homogeneity and to stave off these threats, whether they're in the form of radical political groups, criminal organizations, or affinity groups made up of individuals who are excluded. And one example that comes to mind is something like migrants and the folks at the border who are helping migrants cross into the United States by leaving water out for them and so forth. And then, of course, on the other side, we have amped up U.S. Border Patrol and also those self-appointed vigilante groups who use their weekends to go out and hunt for migrants attempting to cross the border. So in short, depending on the kind of state, depending on the character of the state, it's the state's job to either remediate those elements which threaten to undermine the social whole if they were to expand to a more threatening level, or find ways to forcefully exclude certain elements that it deems to be an existential threat to the reproduction of itself. Now, one of the profound insights that Bataille offers in his analysis of the psychological structure of fascism is that he applies a psychological model to the totality comprised of the heterogeneous and homogeneous realms. And he employs the idea or the concept of an unconscious to describe what happens in the heterogeneous realm. This, in my opinion, is one of the big captures of 20th century materialism in continental philosophy, because what Bataille does effectively is he takes the theoretical construct of Freud, then elaborated and changed somewhat by Carl Jung, and applies it to the dynamics that we're investigating here. And Bataille's implicit notion that the heterogeneous realm is like a social unconscious highlights a problem that attends to psychoanalysis, which is if we are talking about the elements of a society that are impossible to assimilate, or, for example, aspects of the unconscious that are not made conscious to us, this means that we have to overcome a knowledge gap or an epistemological gap, which is unable to render intelligible something outside of a sphere of intelligibility that's already been specified as such. In other words, one of the ways that social homogeneity works is a grid of intelligibility that if you want to be counted as a real subject, as a legitimate subject, and we can say that there are explicit and non-explicit ways in which we are asked to conform to these grids of intelligibility. But Bataille highlights another important problem here, especially as he endeavors to undertake a scientific analysis of the heterogeneous realm. If the heterogeneous realm is like a social unconscious, and that means if it contains objects that are beyond intelligibility in some way, then we're posed with the problem of how do we know what is beyond the known and still claim that it is beyond the known? And this is a problem that attends to psychoanalysis and other theories of the unconscious, which presuppose a knowledge of phenomenon and their origin outside the realm of conscious experience. And this is also one of the problems with theorizing something like psychological repression, and in the way that it's ordinarily understood. If we claim that a certain knowledge or phenomenon is being repressed or is not manifest on the basis of already known social and psychological determinants, well, in some ways, it simply begs the question of what we mean by repression. Hence, theorists, philosophers like Deleuze and Guattari will suggest that what we understand as repression is manifest already as a construction of desire. But in any case, for Bataille, we have to understand that at least some of what we understand as heterogeneous is something that has been set aside, or that has been assigned coordinates that pose themselves as problematic for the reproduction of homogeneity. However, as a scientific point, Bataille believes that in order to overcome the inherent limitation of sciences, of explaining the unexplainable, we must posit what he calls a non-explainable difference, as that which cannot be reduced to scientific investigation or can be made immediately intelligible by any sort of reliable heuristic. And so the challenge that attends to Bataille's methodology here, I believe, is partially resolved in his positing the notion of non-productive expenditure, a concept which will later be articulated in its own way in the work of Deleuze and Guattari. They will call it anti-production, which is essential to producing what they call the body without organs in the work Anti-Oedipus. But as for Bataille, it's the unproductive spending that creates a kind of social cohesion. For Bataille, what he calls the restricted economy or the rational economy has an economic logic, a sort of internal law of conservation that cannot, on its own terms, make an account for the ways in which many societies, groups, cultures, and so forth have partaken in expenditures of great excess that don't have any immediate productive or utilitarian purpose. Among the practices he has in mind are things like animal sacrifice, human sacrifice, and the practice of potlatch that was practiced by indigenous cultures in North America. And there are a few purposes to non-productive expenditure. One of the things that it does is it accesses a collective affect, a collective fantasy that creates a sense of exuberance and social effervescence that coalesces in the formation of social bonds and the restoration of social bonds and the affirmation of communal identity. And so for Bataille, this notion of expenditure or non-productive expenditure is more typical of what he calls a general economy, that in the cosmos, outside the world of a rational economy, there is a massive excess always already being produced, particularly in a prominent example from Bataille, the light and the rays of the sun, which spill upon the Earth and the other planets and which are not harnessed for any particular purpose. And so just to sum up a little bit on the notion of expenditure, it's this exuberance, this affective effervescence that he talks about, and the formation of social bonds that's important. However, it's often the case that the homogeneous realm or a particular form of social homogeneity ignores this tangential aspect of tending towards an expression of excess inherent to all things in the universe, including human beings. And insofar as any particular putatively rational order cannot accommodate the always shifting landscape of desire, which tangentially moves towards an expression and enjoyment of excess outside of that rational order, a danger looms large for that rational order. So let's take a minute to try to put this lofty analysis back on the ground. What does this have to do with fascism? So going back to the beginning of our discussion, let's think about the dynamics of capitalism and how they play out, particularly in something like a liberal democracy. We have not only the capitalist owners and the petty bourgeoisie, but we also have the proletarian who are included within society. They are included in the productive apparatus of society, but excluded from the ownership of the surpluses which capitalism creates. So on Bataille's terms, there is an aspect of proletarian desire which is already in advance rendered heterogeneous to the system, with the proletarian worker being disallowed to access the surplus of their productive labor. The question remains as to where that excess desire can then be invested now that it's part of the heterogeneous realm. Now, it might seem a banal truth that the desire for fascism involves the intensification of a cultural or national identity, or that it entails the creation of something like a totalizing government. Now, we've all probably heard along the way that fascism is the merger of state and corporate power. And so the introduction of private property and corporate property into this equation becomes interesting here. But the question remains, what is the final cause of this totalizing force? Or how does a simple or conventional identity with any of these forces coalesce then into a specifically fascist form of power? Admittedly, we're not going to get a full-fledged theory of political desire in this short essay, but what Bataille does point out is that the figure of the fascist leader, or the strongman, has the effect, to use his language, of attracting or gathering up that affective effervescence of a specific emotional exuberance produced as a derivative of the specific mode of production under industrial capitalism of his time. And to put Bataille's analysis firmly in the 21st century, not much has changed with respect to capital's fundamental logic of exploitation since that time. Now, of course, if we know anything about capitalism, it is subject to a cycle of boom and busts over, like they say, a 6 to 7 year period. And the ongoing exploitation continues to mount as a kind of social tension. And from time to time, and in certain decades, thrusts social homogeneity into a kind of crisis, a deepening crisis, to the extent that capitalism's power to decode the social field, which is actually some language from Deleuze and Guattari, but we can use it here. Capitalism's ability to render everything either into a commodity or an apparatus of production means that all other social codes are subject to an ongoing upheaval by capital. Now, that combined with the constant exclusion of the proletarian desire into the heterogeneous realm creates the conditions by which a fascist figurehead or a fascist leader can emerge. And for Bataille, this particular form of leadership becomes a kind of transcendent leadership. And why is the fascist leader, such as Mussolini or Hitler, transcendent? Well, first and foremost, it's because their status becomes rarefied, lifted above the set of homogeneous social relations in a crisis. And one of the things that various fascisms tend to promise is a reorganization or a revitalization of things like tradition, of the nation, of a sense of dominant culture, a sense of noble culture. Remember that the heterogeneous realm is the realm of this kind of noble desire that positions itself above the homogeneous realm. And it is one that specifically differentiates itself from those things which have been deemed impure with respect to the homogeneous realm on the other end of the pole in the heterogeneous realm. But one of the other important ways that fascist desire differentiates itself from those forms of life which have been marked with a kind of impurity is that fascist desire takes on a character for itself, as Bataille says. Simply put, fascist desire and the fascist figurehead become larger than life. In fact, those lives that offer themselves up in a kind of fealty to fascist desire ultimately become enervated by it. Because as Bataille notes, it creates this kind of libidinal gyre that then enforces a renunciation of things like natural needs. And this is another reason why you see the trope of things like semen retention or the conservation of energy, abstemiousness, aversion to feminine flows, like we see in Klaus Televite's Male Fantasies book, if you've read it. The notion of flow and the image of dissolution become objects of a perceived abjection. In the capitalist milieu, things were already falling apart, things were already decoding, and a sort of implicit thought in the fascist collective fantasy is that if we continue to subject ourselves to these abject images of dissolution, then we will lose this vital strength that has been denied to us in the homogeneous realm. So then, just very briefly, how might fascist desire differ from what we would call either revolutionary desire or communist desire or post-capitalist desire? Well, Unlike the fascist figurehead, which posits itself as a transcendent figure, the worker realizes themselves as an immanent cause for the production of society and production of their world. Part of the collective coming to consciousness of this fact about the worker's immanent relation to the production of capital means taking the kind of collective action that would then affirm that fact. In the Marxist accent, what does that look like? That means seizing the means of production, for example. Or to put it in a certain manner of anarchist thinking, it means destituting those apparatuses so that forms of life can realize themselves in the dismantling of forms of constituent power that is ordinarily associated with the social cohesion of the homogeneous realm. Well, that then raises the question of why doesn't the proletariat, who comprise an overwhelming majority of the population, why don't they rise up in a revolution that coincides with the realization that they are the ones that produce their means of sustenance and the means of capitalist thriving? The simple answer that we could venture on the basis of Bataille's analysis is those elements that have been systematically excluded from society are easily wooed and lured back into an alliance with the capitalists who see the emergent crises, the ongoing crises of homogeneous capitalist society as a way to realize or re-realize a kind of stability that was upended by the functioning of the capitalist system itself. In other words, in the figure of the fascist leader, capital interests see the possibility of not only securing stability, but ensuring the continuity in the face of constant disruptions, which includes disruptions from entities like labor unions and social movements. The alliance between capital interests and an emergent fascist party promises to put an end to the wearisome and exhausting resistance with those whom still identify with that sort of impure, profane pole of the heterogeneous realm. One of the costs in wagering this alliance with the emergent fascist party is a tamping down of the capitalist flows and bringing economic activity and capital accumulation under the banner of a radically nationalist state. Now, in the next installment, in part 2 of my discussion of the psychological structure of fascism, we will extend Bataille's analysis of fascism and its formation as an instrumentalization of the heterogeneous realm, what really doesn't belong to the homogeneous economic order, and how the fascist gambit is ultimately going to fall flat on its face because what it believes to be doing is upending the extant order of things, but in the end actually gives the torch back to the capitalist class, who then continue to enjoy their sovereignty by temporarily integrating those elements that capitalist society itself had initially dejected. I want to thank you for listening to this first episode of Left Hand. I very much welcome your support. If you would like me to continue making audio content and video content of this kind, please become a subscriber on the Left Hand Patreon, which you can find in the links below. Also, I will try to make part 2 available to subscribers first and as soon as possible, so please subscribe if you want to tap in sooner. Okay, take care.